Officer Tim arrests his boss's 12-year-old black daughter, Harriet, while on routine patrol. But 10 minutes later, karma strikes, leaving him grappling with the fallout of his actions. How will he navigate the consequences? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Tim Walker eased his patrol car down the tree-lined streets of Brilliant Grove, the wealthiest neighborhood in town. His eyes scanned the manicured lawns and grand houses, ever vigilant for anything out of place. Tim took pride in keeping this area safe and orderly. As he turned onto Oakwood Drive, Tim noticed a beat-up sedan parked in front of one of the mansions. His brow furrowed. That car didn't belong here. He slowed down, studying the vehicle closely. Probably some gardener or housekeeper, Tim muttered to himself. But a nagging feeling told him to investigate further. He pulled over and got out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt as he approached the suspicious car. Tim's hand instinctively rested near his holster, ready for anything. As he peered inside the empty vehicle, Tim's mind raced with possibilities. Was this car involved in a burglary? Drug deal? He'd seen it all in his 20 years on the force. Tim's radio crackled to life. All units be on the lookout for a silver sedan, possibly involved in a shoplifting incident downtown. He smirked. His instincts had been right as usual. This car was trouble. Just then, a young man emerged from the house carrying a box. He was dressed in ratty jeans and a hoodie, definitely not from around here. Tim's suspicions deepened. "Excuse me, sir," Tim called out, his voice stern and authoritative. "What's your business here?" The young man looked startled. "Oh, I'm just helping my aunt move some stuff. She lives here." Tim's eyes narrowed. He'd heard every excuse in the book. "Is that right? Can I see some ID, please?" As the man fumbled for his wallet, Tim's mind was already made up. This kid was lying, no doubt about it. People like him didn't have aunts in Brilliant Grove. "Listen, son," Tim said, his tone cold and distant. "I'm going to need you to put that box down and keep your hands where I can see them." Fear flashed across the young man's face. "But I didn't do anything wrong. My aunt can vouch for me." Tim ignored his protests. In his experience, people from certain neighborhoods were always up to no good. It was his job to keep Brilliant Grove safe, and he wasn't about to let this punk cause trouble. As Tim reached for his handcuffs, he felt a sense of satisfaction. This was why he became a cop, to maintain order and keep the riffraff out of nice areas like this. His world was black and white, right and wrong, and he knew exactly which side this kid was on. Little did Tim know this encounter would be the start of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. As Officer Tim Walker finished up his encounter with the young man, he climbed back into his patrol car, feeling satisfied with his work. He started the engine and continued his route through Brilliant Grove, his eyes ever watchful for anything out of place. Just a few blocks away, 12-year-old Harriet Richards walked along the sidewalk, her heart beating a little faster with each step. She had been visiting her friend Emma for a play date, but now she couldn't remember which turn to take to get back home. The grand houses and perfectly trimmed hedges all looked the same to her. Harriet pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to open the GPS app. "Come on," she whispered, tapping the screen nervously. "Please work." As she fumbled with her phone, Officer Walker's patrol car rounded the corner. His eyes immediately locked onto Harriet, and his brow furrowed. A young black girl in this neighborhood? That didn't seem right to him. Without hesitation, Tim pulled his car up beside Harriet. She looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of the police cruiser. Her eyes widened with fear as she saw the stern expression on the officer's face. "What are you doing here?" Tim demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "This is a private neighborhood." Harriet felt her throat tighten. She struggled to find her voice, her hands clutching her phone tightly. I'm sorry, officer," she stammered. "I was just visiting my friend Emma, and now I'm trying to find my way home. I think I'm lost." Tim's eyes narrowed suspiciously. He didn't believe her for a second. In his mind, there was no way this girl could have a friend in Brilliant Grove. "Let me see some ID," he barked. Harriet's lower lip trembled. I don't have any ID, sir. I'm only 12. Tim's suspicion grew. He got out of his car, towering over the frightened girl. What's your name? Where do you live? He demanded. My name is Harriet Richards, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I live on Maple Street. My dad is William Richards. He's the CEO of… Tim cut her off. Don't lie to me, young lady. I know every family in this neighborhood, and there are no Richards living here. Tears welled up in Harriet's eyes. She felt scared and confused. Why didn't the officer believe her? Please, sir, she pleaded. I'm telling the truth. Can you help me get home? But Tim wasn't listening. In his mind, he had already decided that Harriet was up to no good. He reached for his handcuffs, causing Harriet to gasp in fear. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Tim ordered. You're coming with me to the station until we figure out what you're really doing here. Harriet's world seemed to spin around her. She couldn't believe this was happening. As Officer Walker approached her with the handcuffs, all she could think was how badly she wished she was home with her parents. Officer Walker's grip tightened on Harriet's arm as he led her to his patrol car. The young girl's heart raced, her mind struggling to understand how this could be happening. Tears streamed down her face, but she remained silent, too frightened to speak. In the car, Tim ordered gruffly, opening the back door. Harriet hesitated, her body trembling. Now, he barked, causing her to flinch. With shaking legs, Harriet climbed into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in her ears like a terrible finality. Through the wire mesh separating the front and back seats, she watched Officer Walker slide into the driver's seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Harriet found her voice again. Please, officer, she pleaded softly, her words choked with tears. My dad is James Richards. He's the CEO of Starlight Industries. If you just call him… That's enough, Tim interrupted, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. His gaze was cold and unyielding. We'll sort this out at the station. Harriet fell silent, her small frame hunched in the back seat. She stared out the window, watching the familiar houses of her neighborhood slip away. Each turn of the wheels took her further from home, further from safety. Officer Walker drove in stony silence, his jaw set in a hard line. In his mind, he was doing his job, protecting the neighborhood from potential troublemakers. He couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize the scared child in his back seat. The drive to the police station felt endless to Harriet. Her mind raced with fears and questions. What would her parents think? Would anyone believe her? The weight of the handcuffs on her wrists felt impossibly heavy. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Harriet's stomach twisted with dread. Officer Walker got out of the car and opened her door. Come on, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Harriet stepped out, her legs wobbly beneath her. She blinked in the harsh sunlight, feeling small and vulnerable. Officer Walker placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her towards the station entrance. With each step, Harriet's fear grew. She wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But all she could do was walk forward, into the unknown darkness of the police station, with Officer Walker's hand firmly on her shoulder. As Officer Walker led Harriet into the police station, the young girl's eyes widened with fear. The bustling activity and stern faces of the officers made her feel even smaller and more alone. Name? A desk sergeant asked gruffly, barely looking up from his computer. Harriet Richards, she replied, her voice trembling. Officer Walker scoffed. Claims to be the daughter of some big-shot CEO, caught her trespassing in Oakwood Heights. The sergeant raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he typed the information into the system. Harriet's heart sank as she realized they didn't believe her. Meanwhile, across town, James Richards was in the middle of a meeting when his phone buzzed insistently. Annoyed, he glanced at the screen and saw multiple missed calls from an unfamiliar number. Excusing himself, he stepped out to return the call. Mr. Richards? A frantic voice answered. This is Melinda, Emma's mom. I'm so sorry to bother you, but Harriet left our house an hour ago and she hasn't made it home. We're worried sick. James felt his stomach drop. What do you mean she hasn't made it home? It's only a few blocks. As Melinda explained the situation, James's worry turned to anger. Without another word, He hung up and dialed the police station. Back at the station, Officer Walker was filling out paperwork when he overheard a commotion at the front desk. "I don't care who you have to talk to," a booming voice echoed through the room. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge right now." Walker's colleague, Officer Crimson, rushed over to him looking pale. "Tim, we've got a situation. That girl you brought in? Her father is here and it's James Richards." Tim felt the blood drain from his face. "James Richards? The CEO?" Johnson nodded grimly. "The one and only, and he's furious." As the realization of his mistake dawned on him, Officer Walker felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He looked towards the front of the station, where he could see a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit arguing with the desk sergeant. "Where is my daughter?" James demanded, his voice carrying through the entire station. "I want to see her right now." Officer Walker swallowed hard, knowing he had made a terrible mistake. He watched, frozen in place, as James Richards was escorted to where Harriet was being held, dreading the confrontation that was sure to come. James Richards burst through the doors of the police station, his eyes blazing with fury. The room fell silent as he strode towards the front desk, his presence commanding attention. "Where is my daughter?" he demanded, his voice booming through the station. Officer Walker, who had been nervously shuffling papers at his desk, felt his stomach drop. He looked up to see his captain approaching James, trying to calm the situation. "Mr. Richards, please, let's discuss this in my office," the captain said, gesturing towards a door. "No," James replied firmly. "I want to see my daughter now, and I want to know who's responsible for this outrage." As if on cue, Harriet was led out from the holding area. Her eyes lit up when she saw her father, and she ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice muffled against his suit jacket. James hugged her tightly, then gently pushed her back to examine her face. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice softening for a moment. Harriet nodded, wiping away a tear. James's expression hardened again as he turned back to the officers. "Now, who arrested my daughter?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm. Officer Walker felt his colleague's eyes on him. Swallowing hard, he stepped forward. "I did, sir," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. James's eyes narrowed as he focused on Walker. "You," he said, pointing a finger at the officer. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You arrested a 12-year-old girl for walking in her own neighborhood." Walker opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He could feel the disapproving stares of his colleagues boring into him. "Mr. Richards," the captain interjected, "I assure you this is not how we typically operate. We'll conduct a full investigation." "Investigation?" James scoffed. "The facts are clear. Your officer saw a black child in a wealthy neighborhood and assumed she didn't belong there. This is racial profiling, plain and simple." Walker's face burned with shame as he realized the truth in James's words. He had acted on his biases without a second thought, and now the consequences of his actions were crashing down around him. "Do you know how much your department relies on donations from businesses like mine?" James continued, addressing the captain. "I've been a strong supporter of law enforcement, but incidents like this make me question that support." The captain's face paled at the implication. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, aware of how much was at stake. As James continued to berate the department, Officer Walker stood rooted to the spot, the full weight of his mistake crushing down on him. In just 10 minutes, he had gone from confidently enforcing the law to potentially jeopardizing his entire department's funding and reputation. The furious presence of James Richards loomed over him, a stark reminder of the far-reaching consequences of his thoughtless actions. In the wake of the confrontation, Officer Tim Walker found himself sitting alone in the station's break room, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. His fellow officers avoided eye contact as they passed by, their silence speaking volumes. Captain Johnson approached, his face stern. "Walker, you're suspended until further notice. Hand over your badge and gun." Tim's hand shook as he complied, the reality of the situation sinking in. As he walked out of the station, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. The drive home was a blur, his mind replaying the events of the day over and over. At home, Tim paced his living room, unable to sit still. The thought of losing his job, his identity, consumed him. He'd been a police officer for over 2 decades. What would he do now? The uncertainty of his future gnawed at him, leaving him feeling hollow and lost. Days passed in a haze of worry and regret. Tim barely slept, his dreams haunted by the fear in Harriet's eyes when he'd wrongfully arrested her. He couldn't shake the image of James Richards' fury, or the disappointment on his captain's face. A week into his suspension, Tim received a call from the station. His heart raced as he answered, expecting the worst. "Walker," Captain Johnson's voice crackled through the phone. "I need you to come in. There's been a development." Tim's stomach churned as he made his way to the station. This was it, he thought. He was going to be fired. As he entered the captain's office, he was surprised to see James Richards sitting there, his face unreadable. Captain Johnson gestured for Tim to sit. "Mr. Richards has a proposition for you, Walker." James leaned forward, his eyes boring into Tim's. "Officer Walker, what you did to my daughter was inexcusable," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "However, I believe in second chances and the power of education." Tim blinked, confusion replacing his dread. What was happening? "Instead of pushing for your dismissal," James continued, "I'm offering an alternative. You'll volunteer at my family's charity for underprivileged children of color. You'll work there, learning about the communities you've misjudged, understanding their struggles and their humanity." Tim's mouth fell open in shock. This was the last thing he'd expected. He looked from James to his captain, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "It's this or losing your job, Walker," Captain Johnson added, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the reality of the ultimatum sank in, Tim felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He was being offered a chance at redemption, but it would mean confronting his biases head-on. The prospect was daunting, but as he looked at James Richards' determined face, he knew he had no choice. The following Saturday morning, Tim Walker stood nervously in front of the Richards Family Community Center. The cheerful yellow building seemed to mock his gloomy mood. He took a deep breath, straightened his casual shirt, and stepped inside. James Richards greeted him at the door, his face stern but not unkind. "Officer Walker, welcome. Let me show you around." As they walked through the bustling center, Tim felt eyes on him. Children of various ages played, studied, and chatted in colorful rooms. The walls were covered with artwork and inspirational quotes. Tim's discomfort grew with each step. James led him to a small classroom. "This is where you'll be teaching, Walker. Your job is to educate these kids about law enforcement, justice, and fairness." Tim nodded, his throat tight. "Mr. Richards, I'm sorry about what happened. I know it doesn't change anything, but..." James held up a hand. "You're right. It doesn't change what happened. But what you do here might change the future. For these kids, and for yourself." As James left, Tim sank into a chair, his head in his hands. How could he teach about justice when he'd acted so unjustly? The irony wasn't lost on him. A gentle knock on the door made him look up. A kind-faced woman entered, smiling. "Hello, Officer Walker. I'm Ms. Santos, the center's director. Your first class will be here soon. Are you ready?" Tim stood, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. "As ready as I'll ever be, ma'am." Ms. Santos patted his arm. "Just be honest with them, officer. That's all anyone can ask." Minutes later, a group of children filed into the room. Tim's heart nearly stopped when he saw Harriet among them. She met his gaze briefly before looking away, her face unreadable. Tim cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Officer Walker. I'm here to talk to you about law enforcement and fairness." A young boy in the front row raised his hand. "Are you gonna arrest us like you did Harriet?" The room fell silent. Tim felt his face burn with shame. He looked at Harriet, who was staring at her desk. "No," Tim said softly. "I'm not here to arrest anyone. I'm here because I made a mistake, a big one, and I'm trying to learn from it." He took a deep breath. "I thought I knew what justice meant. But I realize now that I have a lot to learn. And I'm hoping we can learn together." The children exchanged glances, some curious, others skeptical. Harriet finally looked up, her eyes meeting Tim's. There was no anger there, just a quiet challenge. Tim swallowed hard. This was going to be the hardest assignment of his life, but as he looked at the faces of the children before him, he knew it might also be the most important. As the class settled into their seats, Tim couldn't help but notice Harriet's calm demeanor. She sat quietly, her hands folded on her desk, her eyes attentive. There was no trace of anger or resentment in her expression, despite the ordeal he had put her through just days ago. Tim cleared his throat nervously. "So, does anyone have any questions about law enforcement?" A few hands shot up, but Tim's gaze kept drifting back to Harriet. She didn't raise her hand, but her eyes were fixed on him, not in accusation, but with a quiet curiosity that made him even more uncomfortable. One of the boys asked, "Have you ever caught any bad guys?" Tim shifted in his seat. "Well, yes, I have, but..." He paused, the weight of his recent actions heavy on his shoulders. "Sometimes we make mistakes. We might think someone is doing something wrong when they're not." Harriet's hand went up slowly. Tim's heart raced as he called on her. "Officer Walker," she said, her voice steady and kind. "What do you do when you make a mistake like that?" The question hit Tim like a punch to the gut. He expected anger, accusations, but instead, Harriet's tone was genuinely inquisitive. Her composure in the face of injustice made him feel even more ashamed. That's a great question, Harriet," Tim stammered. "We should always admit our mistakes and try to make things right. It's not easy, but it's important." As the class continued, Tim watched Harriet interact with the other children. She helped a younger girl with her drawing, laughed at a boy's joke, and offered encouragement to a shy child who was afraid to speak up. Her kindness seemed effortless, extending to everyone around her, even him. Tim felt a growing discomfort in his chest. How could this girl, whom he had wrongly accused and arrested, show such compassion? He had judged her based solely on her appearance, while she now treated him with nothing but respect. During a group activity, Tim overheard Harriet talking to her friends. "Officer Walker is here to teach us," she said softly. "We should give him a chance. Everyone deserves that." Her words pierced through Tim's defenses. He had never given her a chance. He had acted on his biases without a second thought. The realization made him feel sick to his stomach. As the class drew to a close, Tim found himself grappling with emotions he couldn't quite name. He had always seen the world in black and white, right and wrong. But Harriet's actions were forcing him to confront the shades of gray in his own thinking. Tim watched as Harriet gathered her things, still smiling, still kind. He wanted to apologize, to make things right, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready to fully face the reality of his prejudice, but for the first time, he couldn't deny its existence. As the days passed, Tim Walker tried his best to maintain an emotional distance from the children at the charity. He focused on teaching them the basics of law enforcement, sticking to facts and procedures. But despite his efforts, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable as he listened to their stories. One afternoon, during a discussion about community policing, a young boy named Marcus raised his hand. "Officer Walker, why did the police stop my dad when he was just walking home from work?" Tim's throat tightened. He fumbled for an answer. "Well, sometimes officers have to investigate suspicious activity." "But my dad wasn't doing anything wrong," Marcus insisted, his eyes wide with confusion. Before Tim could respond, Harriet spoke up gently. "Maybe the officer made a mistake, Marcus. Sometimes that happens, right, Officer Walker?" Tim nodded, feeling a familiar pang of shame. "Yes, Harriet, you're right. Sometimes we make mistakes." As the class continued, more children shared their experiences. Stories of fear, misunderstanding, and mistrust filled the room. Tim found himself struggling to justify actions he once thought were routine. Throughout it all, Harriet's quiet presence was a constant reminder of his own failings. She never brought up her arrest, never accused him directly. Instead, Her kindness towards him and the other children became a mirror, reflecting the harm his actions had caused. During a break, Tim overheard Harriet comforting a younger girl who was upset about a recent encounter with the police. "It's scary," Harriet said softly, "but not all officers are the same. Some are learning to be better." Her words hit Tim hard. He realized that Harriet wasn't just being kind. She was actively trying to build bridges, even after what he had done to her. As the days went on, Tim found it increasingly difficult to maintain his emotional distance. The children's stories, their fears, and their hopes began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. And always, there was Harriet, her compassion a constant challenge to his old way of thinking. As the days at the charity progressed, Harriet began to subtly reach out to Officer Walker. Her approach was gentle, almost imperceptible at first. During a break between activities, she approached him with a curious look in her eyes. "Officer Walker," she said softly, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about why you became a police officer?" Tim shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by her question. He hesitated, then mumbled, "To protect and serve, I guess." Harriet nodded thoughtfully. "That's a big responsibility. What's the hardest part of your job?" Tim found himself struggling to answer. He'd never really thought about it before. "I suppose, making quick decisions in tough situations," he said finally. As the days went on, Harriet continued to ask questions. She never mentioned the incident of her arrest, but her inquiries slowly chipped away at Tim's defenses. "Do you ever get scared when you're on duty?" she asked one day. Tim paused, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But we're trained to handle fear." Harriet's eyes widened with understanding. "I guess everyone gets scared sometimes, even police officers." Her words stuck with Tim long after the conversation ended. He began to see a different side to policing, one that wasn't just about enforcing rules, but about understanding people. During a group discussion about community relations, Harriet raised her hand. "Officer Walker, how do you build trust with people who might be afraid of the police?" Tim opened his mouth to give his standard answer about following the law, but stopped short. He looked around at the eager faces of the children, at Harriet's earnest expression, and realized his old answers weren't enough anymore. I'm not sure I've always done a good job of that," he said slowly. "But I think listening might be a good start." Harriet smiled, and Tim felt something shift inside him. The more he interacted with her and the other children, the more he began to question his old ways of thinking. He started to see the gap between the ideals he claimed to uphold and the actions he had taken. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up after an activity, Harriet asked, "Officer Walker, do you think it's possible for people to change?" Tim looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw not just a young girl, but a wise and compassionate soul who had every right to be angry with him, yet chose kindness instead. "I hope so, Harriet," he said quietly. "I really hope so." As the days passed, Officer Walker found himself spending more time with the children at the charity. He hadn't planned on it, but somehow he kept finding reasons to stay a little longer after each session. One afternoon, he overheard a group of kids talking in hushed tones. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The children looked at each other nervously before one boy, Marcus, spoke up. "We were just talking about what happened to my brother yesterday." Tim raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Marcus took a deep breath. He got stopped by the police on his way home from work. They said he fit the description of someone they were looking for. Tim felt a familiar defensiveness rising in his chest. Well, if he fit the description... But Marcus wasn't finished. "They made him lie on the ground, Officer Walker, in front of everyone. He was still wearing his work uniform." The other children nodded, sharing similar stories. Tim listened, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. He wanted to defend his fellow officers, to explain that they were just doing their jobs, but the words stuck in his throat. "Does that happen a lot?" he found himself asking instead. The children exchanged glances. "More than you'd think," a girl named Jasmine said quietly. As the days went on, Tim heard more stories. Stories of being followed in stores, of parents teaching their children how to act around police to stay safe, of dreams put on hold because of assumptions made about their skin color. One day, during a discussion about community safety, a boy named Tyrell raised his hand. "Officer Walker, how come the police never come when we call them in our neighborhood?" Tim blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "Last month there was a break-in at my aunt's house," Tyrell explained. "She called 911, but no one came for hours. But when something happens in the rich neighborhoods, you guys are there in minutes." Tim felt a knot forming in his stomach. He wanted to argue, to explain about resource allocation and response times, but looking at Tyrell's earnest face, he couldn't find the words. These conversations left Tim feeling unsettled. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the children's stories in his mind. Part of him wanted to dismiss their experiences, to cling to his belief that the system was fair and just. But another part, a growing part, couldn't ignore the pain and frustration in their voices. Still, old habits died hard. When he put on his uniform for his next shift, Tim felt the familiar sense of authority settling over him. He told himself that he was one of the good ones, that he treated everyone fairly. But now a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. As he patrolled the streets, Tim found himself looking at the world through new eyes. He noticed things he'd overlooked before, the way people tensed up when his cruiser drove by, the suspicious glances thrown his way. It made him uncomfortable, but he wasn't quite ready to confront what it all meant. As the weeks passed, Tim Walker found himself growing more comfortable at the charity. The children's laughter no longer set him on edge, and he even caught himself smiling at their antics from time to time. But there was still a barrier between him and Harriet, an unspoken tension that hung in the air whenever they were near each other. One quiet afternoon, as Tim was packing up to leave, Harriet approached him. Her eyes were serious, but there was a gentleness in her voice that caught him off guard. "Officer Walker," she said softly, "can we talk for a minute?" Tim nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Sure, Harriet. What's on your mind?" Harriet took a deep breath. "I wanted to tell you about that day. The day you arrested me." Tim felt his stomach clench. He'd been avoiding this conversation, dreading it. But Harriet's calm demeanor made him listen. "I was so scared," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you pulled up next to me, I thought maybe you were going to help me find my way home. But then you started accusing me, and I didn't know what to do." Tim watched as Harriet's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them away, continuing steadily. "I've never felt so small, so powerless. I kept thinking, what did I do wrong? Why doesn't he believe me? It was like suddenly I wasn't a person anymore, just a problem to be dealt with." Her words hit Tim like a punch to the gut. He remembered the fear in her eyes that day, but he'd dismissed it, convinced he was doing his job. "The worst part," Harriet said, her voice breaking slightly, "was feeling like no matter what I said, you'd already decided I was guilty. That's a terrible feeling, Officer Walker. To know that someone sees you as less than human because of how you look." Tim felt a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but he knew this wasn't the time. Harriet wasn't accusing him or asking for anything. She was simply sharing her truth, and it was more powerful than any angry confrontation could have been. As Harriet finished speaking, she gave Tim a small, sad smile. "I just wanted you to know," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. Tim stood there, rooted to the spot as Harriet's words echoed in his mind. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions that day. It wasn't just about following procedure or enforcing the law. He had made a child feel worthless, powerless, and alone. The weight of this realization settled heavily on Tim's shoulders. He had always seen himself as one of the good guys, but Harriet's story forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His actions, born from his biases, had caused real harm. In the days following Harriet's heartfelt conversation with Officer Walker, a change began to stir within him. The weight of her words lingered, pushing him to reflect on his role at the charity and his place in the community. One morning, as Tim arrived at the center, He found himself looking at the children with new eyes. Each face held a story he had never bothered to see before. He watched as they played, laughed, and sometimes argued, realizing that these were more than just kids from the wrong side of town. They were individuals with dreams, fears, and potential. Feeling a sudden urge to do more, Tim approached the charity's coordinator. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant but determined. "What if we organized a community event? Something to show these kids that law enforcement can be a positive force in their lives." The coordinator's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Officer Walker. What did you have in mind?" As they discussed possibilities, Tim felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. They settled on a fun fair with various activities, including a dunk tank where the kids could try to soak police officers, face painting, and educational booths about community safety. Over the next few weeks, Tim threw himself into organizing the event. He reached out to his colleagues at the police department, convincing them to volunteer their time. He worked tirelessly on creating engaging activities that would both entertain and educate the children. As the day of the event approached, Tim found himself looking forward to his time at the charity more and more. He began to learn the names of all the children, not just Harriet's. He listened to their stories, their hopes, and their fears about the police. One afternoon, as Tim was setting up a booth for the upcoming fair, he noticed a young boy named Marcus struggling with a heavy box. Without hesitation, Tim went over to help. "Thanks, Officer Walker," Marcus said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Tim smiled. "No problem, buddy. That's what I'm here for, to help." As he said those words, Tim realized how much they had come to mean to him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He genuinely wanted to make a difference in these kids' lives. The day of the community event arrived, and Tim felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. As families began to pour in, he saw the joy on the children's faces. They ran from booth to booth, laughing and playing with the very officers they once feared. Tim found himself at the dunk tank, good-naturedly taunting the kids as they tried to hit the target. When Harriet stepped up to take her turn, he caught her eye and saw a glimmer of respect there that hadn't been present before. As he sat on the platform waiting for Harriet's throw, Tim realized that something fundamental had shifted within him. These children were no longer statistics or potential troublemakers in his eyes. They were Harriet, Marcus, Javier, Aisha, individuals with their own stories, hopes, and fears. And he, Officer Tim Walker, had the power to make a positive impact on their lives. The community event unfolded like a vibrant tapestry of laughter, learning, and connection. Officer Tim Walker stood near the entrance, watching as families streamed in, their faces alight with curiosity and excitement. The once empty park now buzzed with life, filled with colorful booths, games, and the tantalizing aroma of hot dogs and popcorn. Tim's eyes swept across the scene, taking in the fruits of weeks of hard work. Children darted from one activity to another, their squeals of delight mixing with the cheerful music playing over the speakers. At the face painting booth, a line of eager kids waited patiently, each emerging with colorful designs of butterflies, superheroes, and police badges adorning their cheeks. As he made his way through the crowd, Tim felt a warmth spreading in his chest. This was different from anything he'd experienced in his years on the force. Here, there were no sirens, no tense confrontations, just pure, unbridled joy. At the safety demonstration area, Tim paused to watch his colleague, Officer Johnson, showing a group of wide-eyed children how to properly fasten a bike helmet. The kids listened intently, their faces serious as they absorbed the important information. Tim couldn't help but smile, realizing that these simple interactions could shape these young minds' perceptions of law enforcement for years to come. As he continued his rounds, Tim found himself at the dunk tank. A crowd had gathered, cheering on a determined little girl as she aimed the ball at the target. With a powerful throw, she hit the bullseye, and the officer in the tank plunged into the water with a splash. The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter, and Tim felt a surge of pride. This was what community policing should be about: fun, trust, and mutual respect. Suddenly, Tim felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Harriet standing there, her eyes shining with happiness. She didn't say a word, but her smile spoke volumes. It was a smile of approval, of acknowledgement for the effort he had put into making this day special. Tim felt a lump form in his throat as he realized how far they had come since that fateful day of her wrongful arrest. Harriet's silent nod of appreciation hit Tim harder than any reprimand or punishment could have. In that moment, he felt the full weight of his past mistakes, but also the liberating possibility of redemption. This work, this connection with the community, was more than just a mandated punishment. It was a chance to make real, lasting change. As Harriet moved on to join her friends at a nearby booth, Tim stood there, a newfound sense of purpose settling over him. He looked around at the joyful faces, the positive interactions between officers and civilians, and felt, for the first time in years, that he was truly contributing to something meaningful. This wasn't just about following orders or enforcing rules. This was about building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a safer, more united community for everyone. As the community event continued in full swing, Officer Tim Walker felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. The day had been going smoothly, with families enjoying the activities and children interacting positively with law enforcement. However, his newfound confidence was about to be tested. While making his way through a crowded area near the food stands, Tim felt something collide with his leg. Startled, he looked down to see a young black boy, no more than 8 years old, stumbling backward after bumping into him. In that split second, old habits kicked in and Tim's body tensed. His hand instinctively moved towards his hip, where his gun would usually be. "Hey, watch where you're going," Tim snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. The boy's eyes widened with fear, and he took a step back, his lower lip trembling. As quickly as it had come, the moment passed and Tim realized his mistake. But it was too late. He saw the boy's parents rushing over, their faces a mix of concern and anger. "What's going on here?" the boy's father demanded, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. Tim's heart sank as he recognized the look of distrust in the man's eyes. It was a look he had seen countless times before, but now it felt different. It hurt. "I'm sorry, sir," Tim stammered, trying to backpedal. "It was just a misunderstanding. The boy accidentally bumped into me and I overreacted." But his words fell flat. The mother hugged her son close, eyeing Tim with suspicion. "Come on, sweetie," she said, leading the boy away. "Let's go somewhere else." As the family walked away, Tim noticed other parents nearby pulling their children closer. The atmosphere around him had shifted. The joy and trust he had worked so hard to build, now replaced with wary glances and whispered conversations. Harriet, who had witnessed the entire interaction from a nearby booth, approached Tim with a look of disappointment. "Officer Walker," she said softly. "What happened?" Tim felt shame wash over him. He had let his guard down, allowed his old biases to resurface in a moment of surprise. All the progress he had made, all the trust he had built, seemed to crumble around him. "I messed up, Harriet," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had changed, but maybe I haven't changed enough." As word of the incident spread through the event, Tim could feel the community's trust in him unraveling. Parents who had earlier been smiling and chatting with him now avoided eye contact. Children who had eagerly approached him for high fives now stayed at a distance. Tim stood there, feeling more alone than ever, realizing that the journey to true change was far from over. His momentary lapse had exposed the deep-rooted nature of his biases, and he knew he had a long way to go to regain the community's trust. Tim Walker stood alone at the edge of the community event, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The cheerful chatter and laughter that had filled the air just moments ago now seemed distant and mocking. He watched as families deliberately steered their children away from him, their eyes filled with mistrust and disappointment. "What have I done?" Tim whispered to himself, his voice thick with regret. He had worked so hard to change, to prove that he could be better. Now, with one thoughtless reaction, it all felt like it was slipping away. As he scanned the crowd, Tim caught sight of Harriet. She stood a short distance away, her eyes fixed on him. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet sadness that made Tim's heart ache even more. He wanted to approach her, to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Tim's mind raced with doubts. How could he have let his old instincts take over so easily? He thought he had made progress, but now he questioned everything. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Maybe I'm fooling myself, Tim thought bitterly. Maybe I can't change after all. He looked around at the charity event he had helped organize. Just an hour ago, he had felt proud of what he'd accomplished. Now it all seemed hollow. The smiles he had worked so hard to earn were gone, replaced by wary glances and hushed conversations. Tim's gaze fell on the volunteer badge pinned to his shirt. He fingered it absently, wondering if he should just take it off and walk away. What was the point of continuing if the community would never trust him again? The thought of facing their judgment day after day made his stomach churn. Yet, as he considered leaving, Tim couldn't help but think of the children he had been working with. He remembered their eager faces as they learned about justice and fairness. Could he really abandon them now? Harriet still watched him from afar, her expression unreadable. Tim wondered what she was thinking. Did she regret giving him a chance? Was she disappointed in him? The uncertainty gnawed at him, adding to his feelings of shame and hopelessness. As the sun began to set on the event, casting long shadows across the park, Tim stood at a crossroads. Should he stay and face the consequences of his actions, or should he walk away from it all? The decision weighed heavily on him as he watched families begin to pack up and leave, the once bustling event winding down to a quiet close. As the last families trickled out of the park, Tim Walker stood rooted to the spot, his mind still swirling with doubt and regret. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice Harriet approaching until she was right beside him. "Officer Walker?" Harriet's soft voice broke through his haze of self-pity. Tim turned, surprised to see her there. "Harriet, I'm sorry," he stammered, unsure of what else to say. Harriet's eyes were kind as she looked up at him. "Can we talk for a minute? Just us?" Tim nodded, following her to a quiet corner of the park. His heart felt heavy, expecting more disappointment. "I saw what happened earlier," Harriet began, her voice gentle but firm. "With the boy." Tim winced, shame washing over him anew. "I messed up, Harriet. I thought I was getting better, but—" Harriet shook her head, interrupting him. "Officer Walker, change doesn't come from never making mistakes. It comes from learning from those mistakes and continuing to try." Her words caught Tim off guard. He blinked, staring at her in disbelief. "But after everything, how can you still have faith in me?" A small smile tugged at Harriet's lips. "Because I've seen how hard you've been trying. You've made real progress, even if you can't see it right now." Tim felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't know if I can face everyone again after this." "That's exactly why you need to," Harriet said earnestly. "Giving up now would mean all your hard work was for nothing. You can do better next time, but only if you keep trying." As Harriet spoke, Tim felt something stir inside him. It was small, barely noticeable at first, but it grew with each word she said. A tiny spark of hope, reigniting in his heart. "You really believe that?" Tim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harriet nodded firmly. "I do. And I think deep down, you do too." Tim took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little. Harriet's faith in him, despite everything that had happened, gave him strength he didn't know he had. "Thank you, Harriet," Tim said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll keep trying. I promise." Harriet smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for, Officer Walker. That's how real change happens." The next day, Tim Walker stood in front of the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. He had called for a meeting, and now faced a small crowd of familiar faces from the charity program. Among them were the young boy he had wrongly suspected and his family, their expressions wary and guarded. Tim took a deep breath, his palms sweaty as he began to speak. "I've asked you all here today because I owe you an apology," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "Especially to you. He nodded towards the young boy and his parents. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Tim as he continued. Yesterday I made a mistake. When this young man accidentally bumped into me, I reacted with suspicion instead of understanding. It was wrong, and I'm truly sorry. Tim paused, gathering his courage before pressing on. The truth is, I've been working on changing my biases. It's been a long journey, and I still have a long way to go. But that's no excuse for my behavior. He looked around at the faces before him, some skeptical, others curious. I want you all to know that I'm committed to doing better. I'm learning every day from this community, especially from the children in our program. They've shown me kindness and patience I didn't deserve. Tim's voice grew stronger as he spoke from his heart. I know I've broken your trust, and I understand if you're hesitant to give me another chance, but I promise you, I will keep working on myself. I will keep trying to be the kind of officer this community deserves. He turned to the young boy and his family. I'm especially sorry to you. No child should ever feel unfairly judged or suspected. I hope you can forgive me, and I promise to do better in the future. As Tim finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. The boy's father stepped forward, his face stern but not unkind. Officer Walker, he said, we appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit your mistakes publicly. The man paused, considering his words carefully. We can't say we trust you completely yet, but we see that you're trying. That counts for something. Tim nodded, understanding the weight of the man's words. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing a mix of emotions, some still doubtful, others showing signs of cautious acceptance. Harriet, standing at the back of the crowd, gave Tim a small, encouraging smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he felt truly committed to walking it. As the days passed, Officer Tim Walker recommitted himself to his work at the charity with renewed determination. Each morning, he arrived at the community center with a sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. Tim started small, focusing on rebuilding trust one interaction at a time. He made a conscious effort to listen more and speak less, paying close attention to the children's stories and experiences. When a young girl shared her fear of walking home alone, Tim didn't dismiss her concerns. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and asked, "What can we do to help you feel safer?" His sincerity didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, the children began to warm up to him again. They started to seek him out, asking questions about his job and sharing their own dreams for the future. Tim found himself looking forward to these conversations, realizing how much he was learning from the kids. One afternoon, Tim organized a friendly basketball game between the children and some of his fellow officers. As he watched them play together, laughing and cheering each other on, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was more than just an assignment now. It was a chance to make a real difference in these kids' lives. The parents, too, began to see the change in Tim. Mrs. Johnson, whose son had been involved in the incident at the community event, approached Tim after a workshop. "Officer Walker," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been watching you these past few weeks. You're really trying, aren't you?" Tim nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I am, Mrs. Johnson. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do better. For all of you." She smiled, patting his arm. "Keep it up, officer. We see your effort." As the weeks went by, Tim's transformation became more apparent. He no longer viewed the children through a lens of suspicion, but saw them as individuals with hopes, fears, and potential. He found himself advocating for the charity program at the police station, encouraging other officers to get involved. One day, as Tim was helping a group of kids with their homework, he caught sight of Harriet watching him from across the room. She gave him a small nod and a smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far he'd come. In that moment, Tim realized that this work had become more than just a way to make amends. It had become a calling. As the weeks passed, James Richards kept a watchful eye on Officer Tim Walker's progress at the charity. From his office window overlooking the community center, James observed the gradual transformation in Walker's demeanor and interactions with the children. One sunny afternoon, James decided it was time to have a heart-to-heart with Walker. He found the officer helping a group of kids with their math homework, patiently explaining fractions to them. "Officer Walker," James called out, "may I have a word with you in private?" Tim looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He nodded, excusing himself from the children. As they walked to a quiet corner of the room, Tim felt a mix of nervousness and curiosity. James gestured for Tim to take a seat. "I've been watching you these past few weeks," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I must say, I'm impressed by the changes I've seen in you." Tim swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Richards. I've been trying my best." James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I can see that. It couldn't have been easy, especially after what happened with Harriet. But you stuck with it, even when things got tough." Tim's eyes welled up with emotion. "I'm so sorry about that day, Mr. Richards. I know I can never fully make up for what I did, but—" James held up a hand, stopping him. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, Tim. I want you to know that I forgive you." The words hit Tim like a wave, washing over him with a sense of relief he hadn't known he needed. You do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do," James affirmed. "Your actions since then have shown me that you're genuinely trying to change. You've faced your mistakes head-on and worked hard to make things right. That takes courage." Tim felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He hadn't realized how much he'd been carrying until this moment. "Thank you, Mr. Richards. That means more to me than you know." James leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "I want you to understand something, Tim. This work you're doing here, it's important. You're making a real difference in these kids' lives. Don't ever forget that." As their conversation came to a close, Tim felt a sense of closure wash over him. The forgiveness he'd received from James was like a balm to his soul, healing wounds he didn't even know he had. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow through the community center windows, Officer Tim Walker was tidying up after another day of volunteering. He wiped down tables and straightened chairs, lost in thought about how much his life had changed in the past few months. Suddenly the lights went out. Tim froze, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Before he could call out, the lights flickered back on, and a chorus of young voices shouted, "Surprise!" Tim blinked, stunned. The children from the charity program stood before him, beaming. They held colorful balloons and handmade signs. At the front of the group stood Harriet, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and joy. "What's all this?" Tim asked, his voice thick with emotion. Harriet stepped forward, a rolled-up piece of paper in her hands. "We wanted to thank you, Officer Walker," she said softly, "for everything you've done, and for how much you've changed." Tim's heart swelled as he looked at the faces of the children he'd come to know and care for. Each one wore a smile that spoke volumes about the trust they'd built together. Harriet held out the rolled paper. "This is for you," she said. With trembling hands, Tim unrolled the paper. It was a drawing, clearly made with great care and attention to detail. In it, a policeman stood with his hand extended toward a small child. The officer's face was kind, his stance welcoming. The child reached back, their tiny hand almost touching the officer's. Beneath the drawing, in careful letters, were the words, "We all need someone to believe in us." Tim stared at the picture, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He looked up at Harriet, who watched him with a gentle smile. "Do you like it?" she asked. Tim nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was husky with emotion. "It's beautiful, Harriet. Thank you." The other children crowded around, eager to see Tim's reaction. As he showed them the drawing, explaining how much it meant to him, Tim realized something profound. He had earned their trust and respect, not through fear or authority, but through genuine care and understanding. The annual Richards Family Charity Gala was in full swing, the elegant ballroom filled with the chatter of guests and the soft strains of classical music. Officer Tim Walker stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with a warm smile. He wore a crisp suit instead of his usual uniform, a physical representation of how much had changed. As he shook hands with another guest, Tim caught sight of Harriet across the room. She was dressed in a pretty blue dress, her hair adorned with a matching ribbon. The sight of her made Tim's heart swell with gratitude and a touch of lingering remorse. Harriet noticed Tim and waved, her smile bright and genuine. She made her way over to him, weaving through the crowd with grace. "Officer Walker," she said, her voice warm. "I'm so glad you could make it." Tim smiled down at her. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Harriet. And please, call me Tim." Harriet nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Okay, Tim. Are you ready to help with the children's art auction?" Tim felt a flutter of nervousness. "I hope so. I've never done anything like this before." Harriet patted his arm reassuringly. "You'll do great. The kids are excited to have you there." As they walked towards the auction area, Tim marveled at how natural it felt to be here, surrounded by people he once viewed with suspicion. The journey hadn't been easy, but moments like these made every struggle worthwhile. The art auction was a lively affair, with colorful paintings and sculptures created by the children from the charity program. Tim found himself caught up in the excitement, encouraging bids and praising the young artists. He felt a sense of pride as he watched the community come together to support these talented kids. During a lull in the bidding, James Richards approached Tim. The two men shook hands, their earlier animosity replaced by mutual respect. "You've come a long way, Tim," James said, his voice low and sincere. "I'm proud of the work you've done with our charity." Tim felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, sir. It means more than I can say." As the evening wore on, Tim found himself reflecting on his journey. He watched as Harriet laughed with her friends, her joy infectious. She caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about forgiveness and second chances. In that moment, Tim realized that he was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of this community, actively working to make it better. The weight of his past biases had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. As the gala continued into the night, Tim Walker found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the ballroom. From this vantage point, he could see the entire room, filled with laughter, music, and the joyous sounds of children playing. His eyes settled on a group of kids from the charity program, engrossed in a game of tag between the elegantly dressed adults. A smile tugged at Tim's lips as he watched them dart around, their faces alight with pure happiness. It was a far cry from the tense, suspicious atmosphere he used to create with his presence. The contrast between then and now struck him deeply. Tim's gaze drifted to Harriet, who was teaching a younger child how to twirl in her party dress. The sight of her patient, kind demeanor brought a lump to his throat. He remembered the day he had wrongfully arrested her, the fear in her eyes and the shame that had followed. Now, here she was, radiating joy and forgiveness. A wave of gratitude washed over Tim. He felt truly blessed to have been given this second chance. It wasn't just about keeping his job or avoiding a scandal. It was about personal growth and redemption. He had been given the opportunity to confront his biases, to learn, and to become a better person. As he continued to observe the scene before him, Tim realized how much his perspective had changed. These children, whom he once viewed with unwarranted suspicion, were now individuals with hopes, dreams, and infinite potential. He felt honored to play a small part in their lives, to help create a world where they could feel safe and respected. Tim understood that his journey was far from over. Redemption wasn't a destination but a continuous process. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments where he'd need to check his thoughts and actions. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face those challenges head-on. With renewed determination, Tim silently recommitted himself to the work he had started. He vowed to continue learning, growing, and striving to be the kind of police officer these children deserved, one who protected and served all members of the community equally. As the charity event drew to a close, Tim Walker found himself standing near the exit, watching as families and children said their goodbyes. The warm glow of the evening's festivities still lingered in the air, and Tim felt a profound sense of contentment wash over him. Harriet approached him, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Officer Walker," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth, "thank you for everything you've done for us." Tim knelt down to meet her gaze, his heart swelling with emotion. "Harriet, I should be thanking you. You've taught me more than I could have ever imagined." As they shared a moment of understanding, James Richards joined them, placing a hand on Tim's shoulder. "Tim," he said, "I'm proud of the progress you've made. You've become an integral part of our community." Tim stood up, feeling a lump in his throat. He looked around at the faces of the children he had come to know and care for, at the Richards family who had given him a second chance, and at his fellow officers who had supported his journey. In that moment, Tim realized that his transformation was complete. The man he had been, rigid, biased, and fearful, was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone who understood the true meaning of protecting and serving. As the last of the guests filtered out, Tim helped the Richards family and the charity staff clean up. He found himself laughing and chatting with everyone, feeling a sense of belonging he had never experienced before in his career. Later, as Tim walked to his car, he paused to look back at the community center. The lights were dimming, but the warmth he felt inside was brighter than ever. He had found his purpose, not just as a police officer, but as a bridge between law enforcement and the community he served. Tim climbed into his patrol car, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just going on duty, he was embarking on a mission to make a real difference in people's lives. As he started the engine, Tim felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had become the man he had always wanted to be, and the road ahead was full of promise. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Tim, James, and Harriet, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.